This is Alan Hardwicke, and I'm doing the second Sunday school in Revelation. We actually are covering quite a bit of material today. Remember that for those who may be new to this, this is based on, we've had a class and I'm reviewing what we've covered in the past. At the very end, I'll actually have some new material. And so pretty soon we'll be slowing down a little bit and taking things going through in more detail. Remember that for questions or comments, you can email me at achardwick@gmail.com. I did not get any comments this last week, but the idea there is to be able to respond to questions either in person or at the first of the lesson. Last time we covered the introduction and the first scene in Revelation, Christ and his message to the 7 churches of Asia. This time we will cover the second scene in the book and get into the third scene. Now is the time to read Revelation 4 through 5, or listen to my reading available on YouTube or on the church Facebook page. In Revelation 4 verse 1, it says that John is being shown what must take place after this. John is going to get a glimpse of God's secret will for the future. Thus, in Revelation 5:1, when we see the scroll in the right hand of God, we understand that future things are sealed in this scroll. From Nehemiah 9:38, we see that covenants were sealed. The sealing is for 3 purposes: to prove the authenticity of the document, to prevent it from being seen, and to prevent tampering with the document. Revelation 4 is giving a good picture of God, who is on the throne of heaven, in verse 2, in spite of what happens on earth. It is good to know that he is in control. The description is obviously beyond what words can express. Verse 3, describing God's appearance, refers to stones with clear and red colors. The rainbow around the throne had the appearance of an emerald or green in color. The appearance was no doubt spectacular. In verse 4, the 24 elders have white robes and crowns. In the next chapter, Revelation 5, verses 9 and 10, the elders, in at least some translations, have been redeemed and made kings and priests, and are therefore not angels if this translation is correct. The number 24 is a double of 12, and I've already said that multiples of 12 in the Bible are often used to refer to either Israel with its 12 tribes or to the church with its 12 apostles. It thus appears that the elders are representing the church in the Old Testament and the New Testament. If the elders are among those who are saved, the white robes may refer to the righteousness of Christ or the works of the saints, and to the crowns to rewards for Christians. In any event, if the works of the saints are being referred to, the works are because of God's grace, and thus the glory for these works goes to God. They recognize this, and in verse 10, they cast their crowns before the throne. They recognize that they cannot boast of these works. In verse 6 of chapter 4, there is a sea of glass before the throne. This description is similar to what we find in Exodus 24 and in Ezekiel 1. The 4 living creatures have similarities to the cherubim and seraphim described in Ezekiel 1 and Isaiah 6 respectively, but with some differences, so they may be another kind of angelic being. Their faces represent creatures that excel among animals in some aspect. One had the face of a lion, representing fierceness. One had the face of a calf or ox, representing strength. One had the face of a man, representing wisdom. And one had the face of an eagle, representing flying. The 4 living creatures and the 24 elders are joined in praise by many angels and by all created things. We see that in Revelation 5:11 and 5:13. Revelation 5 tells us more about Christ, who is found worthy to open the scroll as he is conquered. Revelation 5:5 calls Jesus the root of David. While the Bible may While the Bible also speaks of Jesus being the shoot or offspring of David, this phrase, the root of David, may also point to David being like Jesus. It points to Jesus being our shepherd, just as King David was the shepherd of Israel. It calls him the Lion of the tribe of Judah, which seems to refer to his rule. Lion statues were sometimes used by kings to symbolize their rule. In Revelation 5:6, Jesus is standing as if slain as he was. This picture is of Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. The 7 horns that he has shows his power. He is omnipotent. The 7 eyes are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth, showing the Lamb's omniscience and his close relationship with the Holy Spirit. In Revelation 5:8, the Lamb receives worship and prayers because he is God. Note in chapter 5, verse 11, the 7-fold blessing that is given to God. The number 7 is often associated with either a blessing or cursing, and of course, in this case, a blessing. Now is the time to read Revelation 6:1 through 8:1, or listen to my reading of it. We had noted that the 7 seals is covering material that's in the future, and particularly from the point of view of the church. The 7 trumpets, which we're going to cover as well, in contrast, are covering material in the future, but from the point of view of those who dwell on earth, which is John's way of saying those who are happy with the world system. We mentioned that the first 4 seals make up one group, introduced by the living creatures and having horses with riders, and the last 3 make up another group. Overall, the seals seem to be revealing some bad things in store. It is in this context that the interlude in chapter 7 shows that God seals his servants, which you see that in Revelation 7:3. God protects his servants in the midst of all these things. We also mentioned that Matthew 24 and the parallel passages in Mark and Luke, where Christ talks about the future, are very similar to what John is presenting here. The time period that the seals represent seems to be the same as Matthew 24, from John the apostle and author to the second coming. It refers to a time of great tribulation, and for those who believe that believers will be raptured and not experience the great tribulation, it would put the time period into the 7 years of tribulation. But what about the multitude of Christians coming out of the great tribulation having been killed, as we see in Revelation 7:14? Also remember that with the church at Smyrna, a faithful church, they were not promised deliverance from persecution, but rather eternal life. It seems to me that making this apply to a time when Christians have been raptured out of the world is imposing a scheme upon the text that has been derived from outside the text, which doesn't really fit what the text is talking about. The most difficult of the seals to interpret is the first one. John sees a white horse and a rider with a bow and a crown who is conquering and to conquer. It seems to sound positive with the white color. It is possible that this could be different from the other 3 of this set of 4, which seem to be more negative. In the context of Revelation 4 and 5, which just preceded this, Christ seems to fit the image of one who is conquering. There is nothing in the picture which seems to point directly to Christ, although a crown would fit for him being a king, and others have interpreted it to war or even to the Antichrist disguised as something positive. Matthew 24 talks about wars and rumors of wars and about the gospel being preached throughout the world during the age that we are in. So either a positive meaning or a negative meaning would be possible for this first seal. The bow is a Parthian instrument of war, not a Roman instrument, and the picture itself seems more likely to refer to war and conquest itself. However, based on the previous context and the themes of Christ's victory in the book of Revelation, studies of the words used in the passage and parallel passages, including Christ on a white horse later in Revelation, William Hendrickson, in his book Revelation, on Revelation, which is called More Than Conquerors, makes a good case for it to refer to Christ, but I can certainly see why others would interpret this as referring to war or conquest in general. The second seal has reference to a rider on a bright red horse with a short sword in his hand, not a great sword as the English Standard Version has. This is not a sword for war, but for killing. Although the word slaughter may refer to killing in general, it is often in Revelation referring to the killing of Christ or believers, and the fifth seal refers to this as well. The book of Revelation was written to believers, and religious persecution was more of a problem to them than war in general. Matthew 10:34 refers to the sword accompanying the spreading of God's kingdom. The third seal is broken, and a black horse is seen, and the rider has a pair of scales. It seems to be referring to scarcity on the earth in general, but we know that for Christians who were faithful to Christ, this problem was exacerbated due to not being able to take part in the trade guilds. Scarcity seems to be just partial, affecting the grains, but having less effect on crops from trees and vines, the oil and the wine. In the fourth seal, there is death of a fourth of the earth's population. In these days of coronavirus, we as a nation were scared at a projection of 2.2 million people dying in the United States, or about 0.6% of our population. In 1918, that flu killed about 3 to 6% of the world's population. 2% of the world's population died in World War II, although about 25% of Russia's population died during that war. So you can see if 25% of the population dies, that would be a staggering number. Ezekiel 14:21 shows that God uses war, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts as a means of judgment upon the people of Israel. We know that Revelation often uses numbers symbolically, so it may not be a literal use at all. Fractions often reflect what the denominator by itself would mean symbolically. The number 4 seems to refer to created things, and thus might refer to this occurring over the whole earth in general, not just one part of the earth. North, south, east, and west would all be affected. In the fifth seal, as Hendrickson has pointed out, it's a symbolic vision, not heaven itself. These souls that John sees have been martyred for their faith. We see that these first 5 seals seem to be going on at the same time and present throughout the time from the first coming of Christ to the second coming. In the 6th seal, cosmic disturbances were described before the coming of the Lord. From the Old Testament, this kind of language is used when leaders of nations and nations are being judged. John sees in his vision stars falling from heaven to earth, which is part of a vision, not something happening literally. It does seem to refer to the second coming of Christ in particular with this seal. Before the 7th seal, there is a sealing of God's servants. It's hard to know whether it's talking about sealing them for the seals, which are being broken, or if the sealing is in preparation for the trumpets, which will be introduced soon, or whether it applies to both. There is harm coming upon the earth with both the seals and the trumpets, and indeed they may be referring to the same period of time. Hendrickson says that there are three general purposes of sealing: protects against tampering, marks ownership, and certifies genuine character. In this case, it refers particularly to ownership and protection. He says that this group is the same as the sealed multitude in Revelation 14. 144,000 is a symbolic number of the sealed on earth, the church militant in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. It does not mean Israel of the flesh, as the tribes of Ephraim and Dan are omitted, possibly due to their idol worship that was centered in these tribes. He takes the Great Tribulation as all the persecutions and trials throughout this period. Another interpretation of the Great Tribulation would be at the time of the Antichrist. It appears here that if the passage refers to the whole time between Christ's first and second coming, that the Great Tribulation refers to this whole period of time as well. The Textus Receptus, which is a group of manuscripts that is well respected, at Revelation 7:4, instead of 144,000, it reads 100,000. Most of your versions have changed it to 144,000 because when you take the 12,000 for each of the tribes that are listed and multiply by 12, you get 144,000. But the symbolic 100,000, which is what that Textus Receptus actually says, makes a lot of sense, with 10 representing completeness. And so if it is a symbolic use there, it would symbolize that all of God's servants being sealed. So what is the relationship between 144,000 and the great multitude from every nation? I would argue that they are the same. The 144,000 is a picture of the church, with Israel picturing the church. The 144,000 as a symbolic number makes sense, but it's not limited to just Jews. And the number is actually much greater than 144,000, and that's why it's referred to as a great multitude later in the chapter. Gicino Michael Cassione points out that the number 144,000 is also derived symbolically from Genesis 15:13. If you take 400 years of affliction that the Israelites suffered at that time and multiply by 360 days in a symbolic year, you get 144,000 days. If you take the number of uses of Pharaoh in the first 5 books of the Bible, there are 216 uses. If you divide 144,000 by 216, you get 666.66, etc. 216 is 6 to the third power as well. The point for right now is that 144,000 is a very special number in the Bible, and that Pharaoh, representing the captivity of God's people, is represented by 6 to the third power and by the number 666. Later, when we study the Antichrist, we will see that 6s are associated with Nebuchadnezzar during the second captivity of God's people, and that 666 in Revelation is associated with the Antichrist during a third captivity of God's people. The sealing of the church is by the Holy Spirit according to various passages in the New Testament, including Ephesians 1. The Lamb is their shepherd, which does not make sense logically that he can be both a lamb and a shepherd, but symbolism does not always make logical sense. The living water that he guides his sheep to shows that Jesus is God, and he gives the gift of his Spirit. When the seventh seal is broken, there is silence. Habakkuk 2:20 suggests that silence is to prepare for the terrible character of the judgment to come, according to Hendrickson. The question arises as to how the seals fit in with the trumpets. Some see the book of Revelation as more chronological, while others see these things covering the same period of time from different perspectives. The fact that the sixth seal seems to be just before Christ's return suggests at least some overlap in the time between these events occurs. It is now time to read and listen to Revelation chapter 8 through chapter 9, verse 21. The trumpets are for those who dwell on the earth and are happy with the world system. They are ruled by the prince of the power of the air. The trumpets are to warn them of judgment. There are two basic ways of interpreting the trumpets. One way is to say that these events are occurring throughout the age to warn people to repent. The other way is to interpret them as future events that will come over a short period of time. The first four are grouped together, and then the last three, which have more details about them. Verses 2 through 5 seem to say that these events are occurring because of the prayers of the saints. There is some similarity between the plagues of Egypt and the trumpets. I am indebted to Robert H. Mounts in the book of Revelation for pointing out the similarity to events in Exodus. With the first trumpet, a third of the trees and the grass is burned up. This is like the seventh plague in Exodus 9, the fire and hail that were sent upon Egypt. The number 1/3 is used in quite a few of the events that come with the trumpets, and it certainly may have a symbolic rather than a literal meaning. 3 seems to refer to God many times in the Bible, so a third may be a way of saying that God is bringing this about directly, just like he did with the plagues in Egypt. We do see tornadoes with devastation from hail, and we also see thunderstorms with devastation from hail, but we also see devastation from tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, etc. All of these things harming man's environment can be warnings to man to save him eternally. The more we see the trumpets referring to things that happen commonly, the less they seem to be coming directly from the hand of God, as the plagues of Egypt seem to be. Yet we know that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, and not simply extraordinary events. With the second trumpet, a third of the sea becomes blood, a third of the living creatures die, and a third of the ships are destroyed. This is like the first plague in Exodus 7. In addition to things that affect the sea, including red tide, death of coral, shipwrecks, storms, etc., man's commerce is also affected. The 1/3 again could be a sign that these things come from the hand of God. The sinking of the Titanic might be one of those warnings. With the third trumpet, a third of the fresh water is made bitter. This is like the first plague again, and is like a reverse of Marah, where God made bitter water drinkable. With the fourth trumpet, a third of the sun, moon, and stars, and a third of the day and night are affected. This does not really seem to have a logical explanation, in keeping with the symbolic meaning that God's hand is involved in this. Mount says it's like the 9th plague of darkness in Exodus 10. With the fifth trumpet, Mounts notes similarity to the plague of locusts in Exodus 10, as well as Joel 1 and 2. Also, just as the Israelites were protected from the locusts in Egypt, Christians are protected against these demonic locusts. The king over them seems to be Satan, according to Hendrickson. This is based on the meaning of the names in verse 11, along with the knowledge that Satan seeks to destroy. While demons can affect non-Christians, the Christian cannot be plucked out of the hand of Christ and God, based on John 10. The pain they bring is more emotional and spiritual pain, as opposed to the literal pain that scorpions literally bring. The sixth trumpet speaks of a third of the world being killed. George Eldon Ladd, in a commentary on the book of Revelation, George Eldon Ladd, in a commentary on the Revelation of John, notes that in Revelation 11:17, that it is referring to a vision. These are not literal riders. Mount said these are demonic horsemen. Hendrickson says that this symbolizes instruments of war that we have. Michael Wilcock in I Saw Heaven Opened says that these are tanks, planes, accidents, bombs, cancers, malnutrition. The commentators all seem to see this as some kind of symbolism. The number 200 million is felt to be symbolic by Michael Cassione in Search of Biblical Order, based on the number 10, a number of completeness, and the number 2, making it even more complete. And of course, many multiples of 10 to get that 200 million. It is now time to read or listen to Revelation 11, verses 14 through 19. And this is new material for the class that's been through the rest. With the seventh trumpet, according to Mounts, the reign of God and Christ is established by a great demonstration of divine wrath against the defiant anger of the world. Revelation 11:18 has 7 parts to it, indicating God's judgment. And verse 19 similarly has 7 parts. The book by Michael Cassione on the biblical order does show easily those 7 parts. It's not super easy to see just in the verse as it's written there. And those, in this case, the 7 parts is referring to judgment. And there was a phrase there in verse 11:18 that I want to explore a little bit more. It says, God is destroying the destroyers of the earth. And so I think we can learn more about that destruction in some passages from the Old Testament and New Testament. So I'll be reading from these passages, starting with Proverbs 10, verse 14. Wise men store up knowledge, but with the mouth of the foolish, ruin is at hand. Notice the ruin that comes because of the foolish. Isaiah verse 3, verse 14 and 15. The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord of hosts. Isaiah 10, verses 1 through 2. Woe to those who enact evil statutes and to those who constantly record unjust decisions, so as to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of my people of their rights, so that widows may be their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans. So you see the ruin that they bring upon widows and orphans. Then we have verse 13 in chapter 10 of Isaiah. For he saith, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I am prudent, and I have removed the bounds of the people, and have robbed their treasures, and I have put down the inhabitants like a valiant man. Isaiah 14:20. You will not be united with them in burial, because you have ruined your country. You have slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers not be mentioned forever. So speaking about the ruin to the country that has come about because of the wicked leader. Isaiah 33:1. Woe to you, O destroyer, while you were not destroyed, and he who is treacherous, while others did not deal treacherously with him. As soon as you finish destroying, you will be destroyed, as soon as you cease to deal treacherously, others will deal treacherously with you. In Isaiah 59, 6 through 7, their webs will not become clothing, nor will they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity, and an act of violence is in their hands. Their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Devastation and destruction are in their highways. So what the wicked are doing is leading to devastation and destruction. Daniel 7:23. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. And then John 10, verse 10. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So you can see in those verses that just as Satan is a destroyer, that those who follow Satan destroy. They end up hurting the poor, the orphan, the widow, and they ended up devouring the earth, breaking it to pieces. They're doing everything for their own selves, to make themselves rich, but God is going to bring about their punishment. This is the close of our Sunday school lesson.